Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, Indigenous Health and Climate Change, Passing Solutions with Deborah McGregor. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Please feel free to introduce yourselves and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box below. Today's learning circle will be exploring Indigenous health and climate change, passing on solutions with Deborah McGregor. And I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves in just a few moments. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Serene Squawkin. I'm the Learning Circle Manager. I'm Sealco Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory Apache and Belgian on my father's side. And I'll be your moderator for today's discussion, and joining us working behind the scenes is Cynthia, our production coordinator, and she will be in the background interacting with everyone in the chat. And finally, before we get into today's discussion, I'll just provide a gentle heads up that topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you look after yourself, and if at any point you feel that you need to talk to an elder, friend, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We have some prompts in the chat if you need additional support. Now I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves.
It's good morning for you. I had to think about that. It's good afternoon for me. So happy to be here. I'm Deborah McGregor, and I imagine people are from all over, and I guess folks will be putting that into the chat. So I am in I'm actually in Toronto, but I'm from White Fish River First Nation. I'm in Anishinaabe, but right now I still consider myself to be living and working in my own territories around the Great Lakes where Anishinaabe are. I am at York University at the Faculty of Environmental Urban Change and Osgoode Hall Law School. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. And probably the best way to describe my work is I respond to whatever the needs and priorities are of the First Nations that I work with. So I'm on the Environment Committee for the Assembly of First Nations. I do environment work for Chiefs of Ontario. And I've been finding myself in what I call these climate change circles over the past 5 or 6 years, and had to make it, really had to try to figure out how to learn this topic, particularly from an Indigenous perspective. And I'll talk a bit more about that in my presentation. So I'm looking forward to dialogue and engagement. That's what makes these fun, as opposed to another Zoom presentation where you're just seeing my teeny little head in my PowerPoint. So hopefully there'll be enough food for thought for engagement. I do want to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority. I think they do great work. I like to look at some of the work that they do for any training or education and awareness that I do at some of the First Nations that I work with. So just wanted to acknowledge their work and this invitation to share what I hope is interesting and maybe helpful ways of thinking about Indigenous health and climate change. I will say that I do have a bias, or the lens that I tend to view things through is environmental sustainability, but recognizing that all of the way that Indigenous peoples live, and I'll speak more from an Anishinaabe perspective, is that everything's kind of interconnected. And actually, I think in this presentation as well, I show you some of the models that come from the First Nations Health Authority in terms of like how our health is connected to the health of the natural world. So hopefully I will make sense to you, and this will be helpful. It's good to see so many folks sharing where they are and where they're coming from. So Serene, is there any other housekeeping before okay, so I will do share screen. This worked 15 minutes ago, so hopefully it continues to work. You know, we all have this experience with Zoom where it works and then it doesn't. So can people see that? This is where you need to give a thumbs up. Yeah. Okay, I see some thumbs up. Hey, I haven't seen a thumb up that looks like that before, so that's good. So I always start with that we've always been here as Indigenous peoples. So wherever it is that you are on Turtle Island or even other places in the world, Indigenous peoples were there, and we were whole societies. And to me, that's really important to acknowledge. A lot of the times I find in the health field, Indigenous peoples are always talked about as populations. Populations as part of a society, vulnerable peoples as part of a society, at-risk people because of a society or as part of a broader society, without acknowledging that Indigenous peoples are nations and are societies in and of themselves. I mean, this has been disrupted through colonial and imperialist type of processes, but it's important to know that really for the history of where we are, like where I am in Toronto, Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee space or territories, we were here for thousands of years, and therefore we had our own laws, our own knowledge, our own ways of how we governed ourselves and how we were attending to health, and this enabled sustainable relationships with all of creation. And our view of this is quite broad. It's also our ancestors, future generations, the spirit world. It's not just what you might see in environmental legislation federally or provincially, where they talk about environment in a very narrow kind of way, usually water, land, air, and maybe some acknowledgement of ecological processes. I know this because I looked and I find it limiting in terms of how Indigenous peoples understand this. But it's important to know that when we're talking about First Nations people and self-determination, the assumptions there are that we're societies and nations that work with other nations as part of treaties or other kind of arrangements that we have. So I find in a lot of circles that I'm in, people don't know this. They don't know about this history, and they don't know why Indigenous peoples strive for what they do. So having said this, that we were striving for, like our well-being was tied to the health of the natural world, what I'll just call the natural world, and but we weren't perfect. And this is one of my favorite stories. And the nature of stories is such that you get out of stories what you're intended to get out of stories, what you're ready for in that moment. And so this story I think about as being a climate change story in some respects, or a planetary health story in some respects. In that, in the story, people, and I don't have time to tell it because that would have to be a whole presentation about the story and climate change. Is in the story, people, well, in Anishinaabe, it's an Anishinaabe story, are behaving badly. Like people are not, they're not treating the natural world very well. Our relatives, people are taking more than they need. They're being egotistical. They're harming each other. They're not being respectful. They're not following the instructions and guidance and the ethical and moral conduct that we were given through stories and from creation, and a destruction is coming. And because of this, and in our stories, there's usually a creation, a destruction, and then a recreation. So those are different stories. So this is one that we're to learn from. We were given gifts to live well. We were given gifts to live well with the natural world, and we're not doing it. So in the story, animals always know things before we do, before humans do. And the animals know that something is coming. And the eagle petitions on our behalf to creator. I always say creator/creation, because we tend to think in verb as opposed to noun. And the eagle petitions on our behalf to spare us for love of future generations. That maybe this generation isn't behaving properly in relation to the natural world and each other, but there's still the hope for future generations. So in the story, there's also hope. Creator creation and the eagle agree that the creator will hold back destruction for 4 days if the eagle can find people who are still living up to their responsibilities to care for each other and the natural world. And it isn't until the 4th day that the eagle is able to find people who are doing that, a family who's still doing their offerings before taking water, who are still living well, and then destruction is held back. So we have disaster in our stories, and we have our own knowledge and ethics and ways of how we attend to that disaster and avoid it, ideally. And in the story, a lot of it comes from the natural world. And one of the assumptions there is that the natural world knows way more than we do. Like, the natural world's been around for billions of years, millions of years, depending on whose science you're aligned with. And so it knows more, just like the animals knew before people did that something was happening and they needed to intervene. So a lot of our knowledge also comes from the natural world. So I think about this story as being a climate change story, because that's what we're facing now. That's what we're facing now as humanity, and how are we going to get out of this? And that's why I think about passing on solutions to future generations, or even to the current generation, as opposed to intensified problems, which is kind of what is happening. So when I think about our stories, I look to them for instruction, and how they're instructing us and guiding us in terms of the challenges that we're facing. So again, as I mentioned before, a lot of our responsibilities, so in the Anishinaabe context, we talk about this concept of Minanabodsuin, which is living well. And living well, or a good life, isn't just for people, it's also for I guess our relatives in the natural world. Water lives well, the forest lives well, the animals live well, the fish live well. It's not possible to be well unless our relatives and the natural world is also well. And as we have responsibilities to them, they also have responsibilities to us. So we have this obligation to live well. So we're not just doing damage control, we're not just or harm reduction, which is kind of like the broader kind of narrative around climate change and health, is how do we reduce the harm? How do we mitigate? How do we, as opposed to, which is important, I'm not saying it's not, but what is it like to change your orientation to actually seek to try to live well? What does that look like, as opposed to damage control, which is a lot of where solutions are oriented towards? What can we learn about striving to live well, and what are our responsibilities and obligations in order to do that? And for the work that I do, a lot of that comes from our own stories, knowledge, laws, and governance systems. So planetary health, I just call these the disaster reports that come out. They come out. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the tipping point's already been reached, not good. And the IPBES report on ecosystem right now, as we speak, the COP convention of the Conference of the Parties on Biological Diversity is meeting in Montreal to try to figure out how do we shift this disastrous road that we're on. World Water reports, they're all pointing to not a good picture at all. Basically, disaster, similar to the Pipe and the Eagle story. So how do we avert this in terms of what we can do in terms of our health and our approach to the natural world at multiple scales? So yeah, every time one of these reports comes out, it's getting worse. So again, current generations, future generations are inheriting a big mess because of how I guess humanity as a whole and as a collective are living. So this report came out recently from the United Nations Environment Program, where they were recognizing that we're in a planetary crisis, a planetary health crisis. Probably many of you know the World Health Organization said climate change is one of the greatest health challenges of our time. And it's because of the nature of the relationship that humanity has with the natural world, that this is something that Indigenous peoples already knew. So one of the things I do in my work is I look at international declarations, because I know Anishinaabe thinking the best, but often I'm in a space, as many others are, where we're trying to speak more broadly about Indigenous people. So I look to those declarations. Indigenous peoples from all over the world come, they agree on what they want to say at a particular meeting, and they were calling this for some time. So this wasn't this was known to them, and finally in 2021, this is recognized. And with that, then a Making Peace with Nature report came out. What does that look like? Like that's where we need to head. A tweaking of the status quo, business as usual is not working. And the disaster reports call for this. This report calls for massive transformation that needs to happen in every facet of society and at every scale. So I did want to talk just a little bit about, and again, many of you are going to know this, is the health disparities that Indigenous peoples. So on top of this broader context of the disaster reports, the impacts on the natural world, Indigenous peoples are vulnerable and at risk, but that's not all we are. So there are health disparities of every indicator of health and well-being experienced by Indigenous people. A lot of this due to dispossession and displacement from land, a lot of colonial processes. There's a wounding of the land as well, because again, part of our thinking and Anishinaabe thinking is that we are part of the natural world. And the natural world is part of who we are. Sometimes I've seen in writing where people will say, well, Indigenous people don't distinguish themselves from the natural world or environment. Yeah, well, we can. I know the difference between my arm and a tree, but we understand ourselves to be part of this whole system. So when people are wounded, so can the land also be wounded as well. And there's a lack of recognition of Indigenous governance, laws, rights, as well, that also points to these health disparities. So when these broader, I guess, planetary health crises come, it's not a good mix. and in relation to the health disparities that Indigenous peoples experience as well. I just happen to like this quote because it really emphasizes that as healing of people happen, there also has to be a healing of the land. Again, this real connection between people and the natural world. So the other thing that I wanted to say about the juxtaposition, I guess, for a planetary crisis, health of Indigenous peoples, and this broader narrative that I always see, is particularly internationally or even in the Canadian context, is Indigenous people are at risk, Indigenous people are vulnerable. And I've contributed to this, like in the sense of, I had to write a piece for the IPCC report that was released in 2022, 400 words to talk about risk and vulnerability, Indigenous peoples and water for Canada and the United States. Very hard to do. And then indicate, confidence in terms of this is what's going to happen. And that was the narrative that I was given to work with, not a narrative of how can Indigenous peoples be resilient? Where does resilience lie? How is it that we've faced our annihilation? Because we did in the Canadian context. Most of you probably know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the findings there, murdered, missing, and Indigenous women and girls. So we've already had to face our annihilation, and a lot of it through massive environmental change. So there's some things that Indigenous peoples might know about what this transformation needs to look like at a broader scale in order to survive and ideally live well. So I like this particular work. You can find their declaration. So Turtle Lodge is out of Manitoba. So they had a summit bringing together scientists and knowledge holders from around Turtle Island to talk about climate change, and they developed calls to action. And Onisea Key is Our Changing Earth. So recognizing that there's this is what's happening, but it's also a word that also offers hope for the future. And they laid out a number of calls to action. But one of the things, again, that they said here, a lot of the elders and youth and knowledge holders that were gathered, is that as the earth changes, and it is, because we have all these reports that tell us it's changing, people also have to change. We're not. We still want to live in this very unsustainable kind of way. And because I don't know, I describe it as we want to have our cake and eat it too. We don't want to, we want to just make kind of minor adjustments as opposed to wholesale transformation. What does that look like? Sometimes I think humanity as a whole sort of lacks imagination for what that can look like. Later on, I'll talk about from this making peace with the Earth report is by 2050. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of this COP15 meeting out of Montreal. Is by 2050, how are we going to live in harmony with the Earth? Like, what does that look like to us? What does that mean now? Because it's not that far away. It means practically we'd have to be doing that now, and we're not. Which is why, you know, the next time one of the disaster reports come out, it's probably not going to look good. So we need to change, just as the Earth is changing. And they gave a set of recommendations for what that looks like. Fundamentally, it's about disconnection from the Earth. Like we're not connected to the Earth anymore. And I found this pretty well in every climate change, Indigenous climate change circle that I've been in. And later I'll talk about this session that I facilitated with 70 plus elders and youth. The youth wanted to meet with elders to share knowledge around climate change and develop a path forward. And the knowledge holder said it's basically humanity's disconnection from the Earth. And in Indigenous context, this is really important. And that's what enabled us to be able to survive. It wasn't other people's solutions. It was our connection to the Earth and to the land. So they identified this as being one of the major root causes of why we're experiencing what we're experiencing. So again, I'm just pulling at one of the declarations that I referred to. In 1995, the Beijing Declaration of Indigenous Women. And I just emphasize here that we're to live in harmony with the natural laws of Mother Earth. This is what they were pointing to as being part of the solutions. This is what we need to do. So almost 30 years ago, this is what was being called for by Indigenous women and Indigenous people. What is that? But what does that look like? And again, like going back to my very first slide, people know how to do this. They were doing it for thousands of years. So it is known. In my work, the research work that I'm doing right now, my starting assumption is that Indigenous people have climate knowledge. It's just not being, it's not being, to speak like an academic, mobilized into the realms where it needs to influence decision-making and solutions and plans and strategies. Very few Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, First Nations have climate strategies and plans because we're not funded to do that. That's one of the things that First Nations Health Authority did is for a time they had funding for under health for First Nations to be able to do that. Most of the time, we're trying to fit ourselves into other people's plans and solutions and strategies. The Inuit Tapirsit do have a strategy, but very few actually do. I like to point this out to the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, because they emphasize, again, very similar in terms of Indigenous thinking, accepting our responsibilities to the Earth, to live well, and to future generations, to pass on the future generations those values and traditions and institutions that support the flourishing of the Earth, not just survival, but actually flourishing. What does that look like? I don't even know if we really kind of know anymore, because it's been like this path that we've been on for planetary health crisis, planetary crisis has been for some time. But what I will say here is, although maybe it doesn't seem like it, is that Indigenous people know. So I think about my family, like my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and my ancestors, because colonization, relatively speaking, has been recent compared to colonial forces for 1,000 years or more in other places in the world, has been relatively recent. So we still remember, we still know what it's like to live well with the Earth. We still know what it's like to enable a flourishing of the Earth. And so that's, I think, another area that Indigenous peoples have to offer, that we still remember, like that distance or that gap or that lineage is a lot closer or smaller than when that's been huge and people don't remember anymore. We still do, or there's people who still do. So again, I talked about this before, living in harmony by 2050. This is what folks are trying to figure out. What does that look like? Less than 30 years away. Think about it. Like, think about these disaster reports, what they're saying, all the modeling, what it's pointing to, and then trying to achieve this is going to be a big job. And that does require transformation. And literally, we have to be working on that like now. So they do acknowledge Indigenous knowledge and governance system. I still don't really see laws in there, and a lot of the times our laws do point to what these relationships should look like. What you see internationally and in Canada, what they call nature-based solutions, but I find the nature-based solutions are they still enable, you know, the problem, like a lot of extraction and like one of Canada's solutions is plant a whole bunch of trees. One, I'm thinking, well, you already did that. That's already part of what people already do. And when you do that, that just enables destruction of the environment to occur somewhere else. So the idea of nature-based solutions is really different than what we see, let's say, in the pipe and the eagle story, where recognizing that nature actually has an intelligence that can help us, inform and help us deal with the challenges that we're facing. Again, calling for massive transformation at every level, recognition of Indigenous peoples, but also Indigenous-led. So this is, again, part of Canada's narrative is Indigenous-led climate solutions, but that really hasn't been realized. It's kind of rhetoric. But what do Indigenous-led solutions look like? And recognition of Indigenous knowledge, but not Indigenous knowledge systems, because that's related to recognition of Indigenous peoples as societies and nations. But that's another story. Like, one of my areas of that I work in is Indigenous knowledge systems as well. So, and I think my point here is that this is where we have to have an imagination. What does it look like? What will it look like in our lives now in order to be able to achieve living in harmony with the natural world by 2050? Which for some of us, I probably won't be alive then, but our children will, and maybe our grandchildren will, maybe some of you will. Like, what does that look like? What do we need to do now in order to be able to realize this goal and this vision? Okay, I think that there is some guidance, and again, many of you would know, and for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and again, because I tend to have this environment, this environment sustainability lens to just about everything I read. This is what I honed in on in the TRC right off the hop, was this idea of reconciliation with the earth and the natural world. So here's just some quotes that come from this, that would be guided by Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous laws, governance, protocols, and values. I call it more earth-based reconciliation because it's like water, it's like ice, it's wherever people are in the natural world, that we're really not going to be able to like live well together if we can't live well with the natural world as well. So one of my favorite scholars is Professor Kyle White. He's a Potawatomi, now at the University of Michigan. And he talked about climate change as being a crisis in relationships. So yes, there's an ecological crisis, there's a planetary health crisis, there's a water crisis, there's a crisis happening. And he said, but it's a crisis in relationships. It's a crisis in relationships among people, but also in our relationship with the natural world. And to me, the TRC came out before he wrote this paper, that they were already kind of aware of that we need to work on the relationships with each other, because there's massive inequity in terms of who's actually causing the problem, who's disproportionately impacted by it, which tends to be Indigenous people or other land-based people, or other vulnerable peoples, poor people in the world, people who are marginalized in the world, and or even in the Canadian context. So relationships becomes really important among people in terms of justice and equity, but also in terms of relationship with the natural world. So principles of planetary health. So this is sort of where my thinking has gone recently, because In the work that I do, I start to think about, I do a lot of work around water justice. I'm now delved into climate justice over the last 5 or 6 years, I guess almost like 7 or 8 years now. Environmental justice, and I started to think, how do all of these connect? And it's within this realm of planetary, what's called planetary health. But the planetary health paradigm has, or the mainstream sort of planetary health paradigm has these to me disturbing assumptions, and but although in the more recent literature it seems to be sort of shifting a little bit, but one of its principles, probably in the first paper that I started to read on this, because I thought, how do I connect the water, the ecological crisis, the ecosystem crisis, the biodiversity crisis with climate crisis, environmental crisis? And it was sort of, okay, planetary health is like big enough maybe to be able to do this. And but one of its assumption is that as the destruction of the environment occurred around the globe, around the planet, the health of people went up. I said, well, that's kind of weird. I don't know how you come up with that kind of causal relationship. As opposed to this recognition that I've been talking about for the first 20 to 25 minutes, like this relationship between people and the natural world. And you see this, especially in Indigenous communities, that the health of the natural world completely impacts our health in so many different ways, especially if you look at health holistically. I actually refer to it more as planetary well-being. Again, this thing that we want to be, seeking and trying to move towards. And I was asked this recently because it can be really overwhelming when you're reading what I call the disaster reports, and you're trying to. I'm on these different committees. I was on the health committee, for the development of the national adaptation strategy. I've been contributing to the Lancet Health Policy briefs on climate change over the last few years, that it can really become overwhelming and easy to kind of, lose hope. And that's why I tend to look at more like planetary well-being, because it gives you something to it gives you hope. It gives you something to try to strive for, as opposed to wallow in what all the problems are. And maybe through looking at something that you want to strive for, it gives you some sense of imagination in terms of what can potentially be solutions. So there's a scholar, she's now at University of Western Ontario, Nicole Redbeer, she's Dene, and she's starting to work with the idea of planetary health and basing it on Indigenous thinking. So in some of her work, and this is all very recent within the last couple of years, is she talks about natural law, First Nations law, not human created laws, about our deep connection to living and all living things. This is one of the principles that needs to form the foundation of planetary health. Different values come into play: honesty, love, empathy, and justice. I don't often see love talked about in a lot of these other climate change circles that I find myself in, but they're always in Indigenous. We always talk about that: love for future generations, love for the earth. That's a core value in terms of how that would inform what we understand our solutions to be. And also Indigenous knowledge systems. How do our knowledge systems inform this? In my experience with the IPCC reports, because there's been 2 or 3 times when I've had to work with others to prepare some of the contributions to it, there's a huge bias in terms of the knowledge that we rely on is very specific. I had to look at what was published in the last 5 years. You have to do the traceability chart to show how does this article make the point that you want to make in terms of high confidence, medium confidence, low confidence, in terms this is what we think is going to happen. And so, but a lot of Indigenous knowledge isn't into peer-reviewed literature. A lot of the knowledge that's being generated to inform these big assessments is hugely biased. It's not including Indigenous knowledge. It's also more biased towards the natural and technical sciences. Someone actually did a study on this. They looked at the last 50 years and what's been funded, not a lot on the social sciences and humanities, which is, they'd be looking at the behavior changes that need to happen, like our value changes that need to happen, the transformations that people need to go through. And it was like 780% in terms of who's funded, who's doing the research, who's asking the questions. And if, as researchers, if we're not asking the right questions, we're not going to be gathering or generating that knowledge that's needed to come up with innovative solutions. So there is a huge bias in terms of even these assessments, because I've had to do them, and it was really hard to do when you were when there was limited knowledge. Like we did one looking at Indigenous climate governance, hardly anything. Again, partly because very few First Nations or Indigenous peoples in Canada have these plans and strategies. Most of the times we're fitting ourselves into other people's, so other people's kind of solutions, as opposed to developing our own based on our own knowledge and laws and societies. Nicole Redveers and her colleagues go on to describe the planet as a web of life, recognition that the Earth is a living being, a person, so similar to that Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth that I talked about, that was developed at a climate change conference in 2010. So this thinking has been around, well, I would say for thousands of years, but starting to come out more in these, world environmental sustainability and climate meetings over the last few decades. Well-being of the planet, and people should be at the heart of decision-making, as opposed to what tends to be at the heart of decision-making. And spirituality is an important part of this. Draws on, again, different values of love, kindness, justice, and equity. So colonial context for planetary well-being. In my view, if you don't account for colonialism in anything in Canada in terms of well-being or environmental sustainability or climate change, there's a real risk of recolonizing or continuing to support colonization in Canada. So you actually have to account for colonization in this. So when I start off by talking about the pipe and the eagle story, we faced challenges. We weren't perfect. I'm never going to say that we were perfect. I know enough about the stories that I work with in the community to know that we're not perfect. The difference was, for really most of our history, for thousands of years, we could solve problems on our own terms. We had our own solutions. We had our own values and principles that would inform what those solutions would be. That hasn't been the case, for a quarter of 250 years or more, on Turtle Island, some places 500 years or more. That's been severely disrupted. We don't get to determine what our solutions can be. So colonization hugely interferes with our ability to be able to self-determine what our own future can be. Also, in terms of the knowledge that we would rely on in order to come up with our own approaches to as we face challenges, and a lot of them collective challenges faced by humanity. I've been in a lot of, again, climate change circles where people don't understand what colonization has to do with it. And then I get frustrated in those sort of contexts, because I think I'd really like to contribute what I consider to be Indigenous climate knowledge, but here I am explaining what's already found in the Truth and Reconciliation report. So people really kind of need to understand like the situation that Indigenous peoples find themselves in, why it's really important to be able to support Indigenous-led solutions and leadership and initiatives, and not always trying to make us fit into these other processes. And it's not that we're not willing to do that. I think they do make them better processes. But again, a lot of the times, in my experience, the solutions have already been sort of determined, and then we're trying to slot ourselves into that. So again, I've talked about these assumptions. Indigenous societies are more vulnerable to climate change impacts due to these broader forces. But we've also adapted and survived. Like I can say, I'm Deborah McGregor from the Anishinaabe Nation. So my ancestors enable us to be able to survive, despite, in Canada, John A. Macdonald saying there will be no Indians in 100 years. But here we are. So we figured out how to transform and adapt and survive. What did that look like? What did we rely on to be able to do that? Colonialism as Indigenous climate injustice. Again, drawing upon the work of Kyle White, that a lot of the times Indigenous peoples understand our vulnerability as intensified colonialism. Again, because we faced massive environmental change. And I find sometimes in the circles, again, that I'm in, especially when people are wanting to do modeling, they want to differentiate between environmental change and climate change. Indigenous people kind of experience it more as a continuum, not as there's a line. This is an environmental change and that's a climate change. Because of course, what's happening in the environment affects, climate. So unfortunately, a lot of the laws and policies and practices continue to support this colonial agenda. And it's one of the reasons why in my work, I'm really looking at, well, what are our laws? What kind of decision do we need to make to attend to these huge challenges that we're facing? Because whatever laws and policies and everything else that are in place, they're failing. And every disaster report that comes out says that. Like they're not working. They're not leading to long-term sustainability. So what did we do? How did we survive? So maybe some of you are old enough to remember the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report that came out in 1996. And in this report, the main finding, and you can still find this online, these reports, if you go to the highlight report, it just sort of highlights, like it was a lot of volumes. And what the main finding was that solutions that had been derived by colonial and then later Canadian government were wrong in relation to Indigenous people. So their idea of solving, the Indian problem and problems that Indians are facing were wrong. So what is it that we did in order to be able to survive? How is it that I can be here and talk to you as an Anishinaabe person? And a lot of it had to do with our own knowledge. It had to do with our own laws and our own practices. A lot of it had to go underground, but it's still there. So it's our own governance, our own laws, and a lot of it, I should say, they're earth-based, land-based, because for Inuit, a lot of it might be on ice, and others it might be in the sea, on the water. So probably earth-based is more accurate. And this is just my family in the sugar bush that we continue this practice. So there's this like really interesting, it's not interesting, it's a tension. There's tension between you're impacted by environmental and climate change and more vulnerable because of your close connection, not only if just a connection, but the way that you live. The laws come from the land, knowledge comes from the land, language comes from the land. And that's severely impacted by environmental and climate change. But that's the very thing that you need to keep you who you are, to enable you to survive, enable you to be able to flourish. So there's this tension that exists in terms of being able to envision a future or currently living in relationship in balance with the natural world. So that tension exists now in terms of this, but that's what enabled us to be able to survive. It wasn't other people's solutions with the Royal Commission, because a lot of these solutions are actually meant to assimilate. A lot of them have an underlying assumption of, if only we could get these people up to speed and accept our solutions, everything would be cool. And believe me, I've recently been in meetings like that, and I've been appalled that that sort of attitude persists, as opposed to thinking, well, maybe people have their own ideas of what their solutions could be that make sense for them. A lot of our resilience lies within this as well. Probably research starting to come out on this. I'm starting to look at this. What it enables in resilience, particularly in the face of I guess what people call climate disasters, natural disasters, the floods, the fires, like what enables people to be resilient in the face of this. And so again, what I've seen so far, and again, I probably 2 years since I really looked at it when we were again preparing a piece for the IPCC report, was the more cohesive communities were, the more people relied on their own values and traditions and kind of helped each other out. Again, the kindness and love, those kind of values, those were the more resilient. Those are the more resilient communities. And right now, again, I'm looking to see what else people have said about this. That's what our well-being is tied to that. Again, we're not just trying to survive. We want to be well. Like, what does it mean to be well? Be well with the world in a holistic sense that would include natural world, future generations, in the work that we do. So again, I wanted to talk a little bit about this elder youth gathering, because this is where a lot of my aha moments came. And a lot of my aha moments came because I think I was I was finding myself in circles that were very prescribed, again, fit into these broader systems, and they weren't necessarily rooted in the Indigenous experience and lived realities. And again, this conference or this gathering was one that the youth actually led, and they wanted to meet with elders. And this is where I had the aha moment that other people's solutions can actually be hugely problematic for Indigenous people. Like other people's solutions can actually produce inequity in Indigenous communities, or they make no sense whatsoever in an Indigenous context. And another part of this came from, what are the values that are really important for trying to realize what our future might be? Because you don't want to meet with youth and just talk about everything, say everything's hopeless. You want people to sort of figure out, how can we start to imagine what our future can be? What does that look like? What's going to be the basis of this future that we're wanting to seek? And what you see is this image that the youth, like, they were producing art as a way to express that. And they talked about love and the earth, loving future generations. That's what we want to be able to do. Those would be the basis that we would imagine a future. And that was probably the first time I came across the concept of love within these gatherings, and been in these other meetings, and people are talking about electric cars and carbon. People like to talk about carbon, which is fair, but they don't want to talk about the other C words like capitalism and colonialism. I call those the other C words. They don't want to go there. And so in Indigenous context, people talk about this very differently. You talk about the other stuff, but there's a whole set of another narrative that comes into play. Indigenous knowledge was really important. And again, being able to pass on this knowledge to future generations. The youth said, we're experiencing a disconnection from the earth. We want to be on the land. We want to know the medicines. We want to know how to take care of ourselves. We want to know how to take care of our families. And a lot of it means, being on the earth and having a connection and a relationship and knowledge and skills associated with that. And what was interesting was the solutions that were being proposed by governments, because they funded this, so they were presenting, their solutions, but they were trying to get buy-in, I guess, from the participants that were here. I found that a lot of their solutions were almost geared towards getting people off the land, whereas Indigenous solutions were, we want to be on the land. This is where our knowledge and language and everything else comes from. That's central to our ability to be able to live into the future. The role of language is really important. So this is starting to become more studied, because right now you see this in the United Nations, is Indigenous peoples caretake, for lack of a better word, or steward, some people might say, about 20% of the land mass on the planet, but that's where 80% of the biodiversity is found. And maybe Indigenous peoples, the UN data points to about 400 million or so of Indigenous peoples on the planet, compared to the however many billions there are now. And that's also where Indigenous languages are spoken. So there's a connection between the biodiversity, where Indigenous people, how they steward and govern, and the laws that help with that, and language. And this is true in Canada. Most species at risk, and species at risk are the ones that are surviving annihilation, are found in First Nation communities. So there's something about those practices and language that becomes really important. People are starting to study this and try to understand it. So language revitalization is climate action, is moving towards planetary health, and often that connection isn't made. But it was being made here, and they hadn't read any of this stuff. A lot of community people don't have access to the journals and reports, because a lot of them are behind paywalls and such. But people said this is really important. We wanted to be able to self-determine our own solutions. What does that look like? How do you move towards a future that you want, as opposed to wallowing in the disaster that we find? Having an imagination, being creative, thinking in really innovative ways in order to be able to move towards solutions. So this came up again in this gathering. What do our own solutions look like if we base it on our own knowledge, our lived experience, and what we know, and what enable us to be able to survive? Earth, language, and identity. I've talked a bit about this. So this is what the youth were generating as part of their solution building. What does it mean to live on the land? What does it mean to speak the language and start learning the language? And this is why in a lot of climate action, a lot of it for Indigenous peoples is land defense. A lot of people, they don't make that connection. That's why, because that's what's going to enable, and that's going to benefit everybody to be able to protect the land and water and the natural worlds. Listening to the land. So this again relates back to the first story that I was talking about. And this is just me thinking this through and going, okay, well, what can this look like in terms of research? Like a lot of these circles I find myself in, I think to myself, and sometimes I've said it, I said, if we didn't ask the right questions 5 decades ago, 4 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 2 decades ago, because it takes a while to do the research, get the funding, get the knowledge mobilized out there, we don't have a necessary knowledge we have right now that people are using for assessments, decision makings, developing plans and strategies to solve this. So, because it's so hugely biased, right? Indigenous peoples and others weren't part of these places that were funded and asking all these questions, right? So what is it? What does Indigenous climate knowledge look like? How can we start to try to understand that? So this is sort of what I wrap my head around. And I call it listening to the land. So the project I'm working on right now is based on the 13 moon system, because a lot of what I hear in a lot of these sciencey circles is, well, you don't have the baseline. You don't have the baseline. We don't actually really know what the change is. I'm like, well, people know because they lived through it. Like literally they know. And also we do know because we did have systems for how we were organizing knowledge. And one of them was through the 13 moons. What's supposed to be happening during these moons? So last week was a full moon, or it could be around the new moon. So we have stories around those moons and what should be happening ecologically, what we would be doing in terms of our food, or what we were doing in terms of our health a lot of the times. And so we already had that. We already have those stories. We already know what's supposed to be happening. And when that's not happening, then we know that's a change. And this, so even that, like that's the moon. So moon's included in our idea of the natural worlds and the environment. Moon's not included as part of, Environment Canada legislation, definitions of the environment, but it's part of ours, the moon, the sun, the stars. So this relationship that we have with the moon that influences what's happening, influencing us and on the planet, but also the turtle. So the turtle, so what's happening on the land? So we have this direct connection between the moon and the turtle and the water and people. And what the turtle has around it is, I don't remember what the scientific word is. There is one for, I don't know if you can see my, where I'm pointing with the mouse is around the outside of the turtle shell is like 28. There's 28 segments there, for lack of a better word. And just like our moon is based on 28 days, and the full moon would come. And so there's a connection between that and the turtle. And in a year, there would be 13 moons. So there's 28 around the turtle there. And then there's 13, whatever these are I'm pointing to on the turtle's back. There's 13, again, other kind of segments within the turtle, which is totally directed, which is totally corresponding to the moon and those kind of cycles. And so this connection from the turtle, what's on the land, to the moon and what people are doing. So I don't understand all these connections right now. I'm just going, okay, well, how did we do it? What did we do? What does our climate knowledge look like? And how did it inform our decision making? And they would be also referred to as natural law. We don't control the moon. The moon's going to go through The moon's going to go through its cycle. And I actually counted on a poor little turtle crossing the road there too. Kept moving and I had to keep going, stop, so I can keep counting. Because I'd already heard this, like the turtle and the connection to the moon and people in connection to the moon as well. Excuse me, I will stop talking. So this is stuff that I'm working on right now to try to understand this a little bit and try to, I guess, advocate for the fact that Indigenous peoples have climate knowledge. It just doesn't look like what you might find in, science, that journal. Models of well-being, I talked about this. This actually comes from the First Nations Health Authority, but I just wanted to emphasize that there's a relationship between people and the natural world, and that's tied to our well-being. So it's already in our thinking. Recently, probably the last maybe 18 months, I've been finding myself in the One Health circle. Some of you are probably familiar with the One Health sort of approach, especially to pandemics. And I went, Indigenous people's already had this, but our concept looked different. Like with One Health, they have like animals, sometimes they add other things to it, environment, and then people. I'm like, well, we already kind of had that, but it was conceptualized differently. And these are some of the concepts that I often refer to. So I like to think about going back to our first story, our relatives, the natural world. What is the story the Earth is telling us about climate change? Earth, that's what the Earth is doing. These things are happening, and are we going to get it or not get it? What is the story that the Earth's trying to tell? What are the stories that the Earth and our relatives told us before over time that shows up in our stories and in our narrative, and how we pay attention and respect to our ancestors? These would be sort of like what our methods might be to understand what's happening now based on what we've known before. That would give us guidance for how to move into the future. And I think about our stories is another way of telling a story about the Earth. Science has its own way of telling a story about the Earth, and I'm not saying that's not important. What I prefer to frame it as, that's true. Like, think about the IPCC definition of climate change. It's true. I'm not saying it's not true. It's just not the whole truth. And Indigenous peoples have a different idea about what climate change is. That's bad, but a lot bigger in terms of what could be the root causes. So this is, it's another way of understanding what's going on and then helping us understand and then hopefully, learn from it and then move forward. So the pipe and the eagle story is consistent with the IPCC reports. Humans are the cause of climate change, but we also hold the key to changing the course of destruction that we face. So in our stories, people can be destructive, but we can also be brilliant. We can also be creative. We can also be innovative. We can also be imaginative. And maybe we're not doing enough of that because we're just, it's scary to think about a lot of the times. And we need to start moving into this space of what does it mean to live well with the Earth, like tomorrow, today, ideally as a global society by 2050. And we need to turn to nature for guidance, or that's what Indigenous peoples tend to do. So passing on solutions. Again, this comes from the Turtle Lodge declaration or calls to action. In order to effectively deal with climate change, there must be a change of heart. Like we need to change. People need to change. We need to change. We need to change, I guess, our values. It needs to come from our heart. We're already pretty good at, producing knowledge that comes from our head, but we need to produce knowledge, action that also comes from our heart. Our future, love and the Earth. So we might ask ourselves these kind of questions. This is my niece, she's 2 years old, and the sugar bush. My family sugar bush. Do we love our future generations? How do we show that all the time? How will our work benefit future generations? What are we doing? What are we doing now to show that? And we also have to realize we're going to be ancestors. So we all have ancestors, and what did they do? And I guess what we see now is what we, what we have, what our ancestors provided for us. My ancestors enabled me to be here, but what kind of ancestor are we going to be? What does that look like? What are people going to say about us in 2050? Did we achieve this living in harmony with the natural world by then, by taking a damage control, mitigation, harm reduction type approach, or really stopping the harm and moving towards living in harmony with the natural world. And I'll leave you with this. This is from an amazing storyteller in Isaac Day, my favorite storyteller. And he talks about how we're all in this sacred story. What we see now is an unfolding story of the earth, and we're all part of it. And we all have something to contribute to the solution and making it whole again. A lot of the work that I find myself in, and you see this with Climate Science 250 plan, is Indigenous knowledge, Western science. We need all the knowledge to come together to allow the unfolding, ideally, of living in harmony with the earth and the continuance of life. So we're all in this. We're all in this together. So Miigwech, I think I took a little bit more time than I intended, but hopefully me sharing this gave you some ideas, some food for thought, and it all kind of made sense to you in terms of how I link climate change and health and solutions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Deborah, it was really great to hear about climate change and how earth-based reconciliation works. And yeah, we have a few questions here. I'm just going to ask now. What type of resources do you think Indigenous people need to mitigate the impact of climate change?
I mean, my huge bias here is people need support to develop their own plans and strategies from the ground up. Because right now, again, as I pointed out, there's very few. I mean, and I searched, and I had students search because I'm like not that great at searching, and there's not, because I really think once people can do that work based on knowledge and language and their own values and lived experience, that's going to be helpful to others actually, and you can scale it up to different levels, but that hasn't happened. Like I said, the Inuit Tapirset have a strategy. AFN's working on one. They just had the national gathering at the end of September that I had the privilege of being at, but there really hasn't been the support for Indigenous folks to develop their own processes. Yeah, I think that needs to be done. As well, and support for Indigenous climate action, for land-based activities, for language revitalization, because that's what's going to inform those kind of processes. There's a huge gap we found.
Thank you for that. And the next question is, do we have the right folks reviewing the grant applications? Are there social scientists on the panels? If change is required, funding, panel representation, how can I help?
That is a big problem. I think to some extent, this was maybe it was something a couple of weeks ago that I was in. Like, people don't really know how to assess. We would call it interdisciplinary work. Like, yeah, there needs to be more. But even social scientists, a lot of it, who's at the table helping to make these kind of decisions? There could be social scientists, but is it? Or people from the community, which they're trying to do a little bit more in terms of Indigenous assessments for sure, and CIHR I think does that. I think NSERC's way behind in that respect. But I think some of those new grant opportunities, like the transformation, they're trying to do that. Like, you must have social science and humanities and science people on this team. But I think that you need to still be able to assess that. And I think there needs to be different kind of funding models, and in terms of even the questions that are supported and asked for, like what kind of research would support the implementation of Climate Science 250 that Canada has. Like, they have they have these goals set out, but what is it that you actually have to do in order to make all of that a reality? And it means that, the paradigm so far hasn't really been producing the knowledge that leads to the kind of solutions that we need. And it's not that people are doing great work, but they're not making the connections that need to be made. And because, as I mentioned, when I was doing these assessments, in my opinion, there was big gaps in terms of, I need this and it doesn't exist, and it has to be within the last 5 years, and it has to. So I think we could do a much better job in producing more or generating knowledge that I think is going to be a lot more helpful. So for example, there's a lot on monitoring. And the way that Indigenous peoples and knowledge tends to happen in relation to monitoring is like Indigenous knowledge fitting into whatever models that people are developing. Indigenous peoples are kind of like the informants or take people out on the land. So things could be measured on the ice or whatever, but you're not the decision maker in that situation. And then that knowledge often isn't mobilized for decision making at the community level. It's usually fitting into, or it's usually slotting into a lot of these other kind of processes. So I think there needs to be different ways of thinking about once you generate the knowledge, what's supposed to happen with it. And I haven't really seen that. It could be a lot better. So knowledge is being generated, but it's not being, I'll just say mobilized. It's a crazy word to be using for actual decision making in communities. That part's kind of left out of the funding. I find people say it'll influence decision making. I'm like, how? Like where's the link between generating this and actual decision making? So yeah, that's a good point, and people are aware of it. But again, the solution part of it is going to require different kind of funding models and different people being there to be able to, I guess, assess outside of their comfort zone and expertise. Yeah, and that's hard because we don't like to do that.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, Deborah spoke about needing tangible solutions to achieve our goals of planetary harmony. Could you give an example of a big, broad environmental change that could be achieved in the next decade or two?
To me, I think one of them would be, this is pointing more to values. And I think it's understanding that really truly we're part of the natural world, that we are, and that we approach it with humility. And so this is what I'll give as an example, because it was astonishing to me, but not in a good way. And it was because you can probably find this on CBC with Matt Galloway, The Current. And it was during when they were holding the COP meetings for climate change in Egypt. And it was maybe I remember it was a Thursday. And the program was called Climate Repair, which I hadn't heard of actually. And the idea of climate repair, again, it's this narrative of mitigation and damage control and harm reduction. And those kind of things are important, but that's not really leading to transformation. And this is where there was a total lack of humility on behalf of people and not respect for nature. And it was some fellow was developing an ice making machine that they wanted to take to the north to make ice as a mitigation kind of thing. Another one, so I'm like, okay, I guess. And the other one was people who want to make whale poo. So the baleen whale's poo comes to the surface, and I guess different things eat it and interact with it, and then it becomes a carbon sink. And because the whales are, their populations are diminishing due to humans doing nasty things to their habitat, natural world, and hunting them, that people want to make the whale poo. My initial thinking was, well, whales can make their own poo. I don't think humans need to make whale poo, but that became the solution, as opposed to, oh, maybe we need to ensure that the whales flourish, the baleen whales flourish, they can make their own poo and it can be a carbon sink, right? And so again, it became like, to me, that's so arrogant for people to think they can do what the whale does. And as opposed to actually respecting the whale in and of itself, whale doing whatever it is that whale does is actually helpful for the natural world. And so there's, to me, a real lack of humility in those kind of solutions. The other part of it was that so that was sort of like my initial reaction. I was appalled, and was they really hadn't got, they really didn't have any participation, or I don't want to use the word buy-in, from the communities in the north, because that was Matt Galloway's question. He just said, well, are communities in the north into this? So like, no, like they had this techno fix, what I'll call the techno fix, and they wanted then approach the communities after the fact, after they've created this, and then try to get their buy-in. So maybe 5 years or 10 years from now, maybe they would, but it was again created from the outside now we're going to go to the communities and see if there's going to be any buy-in. The ideas didn't emerge from the communities themselves. So the answer to that question is we need to have humility about where we are in the natural world. I think we also need to change our values. I was thinking about this because it's really, really hard for people to do this. And that is, we have to let go of the fact that the consumer in Canada anyway, this isn't true of everybody on the planet, that we need to let go of this idea that we're going to consume, that the life that we're living is sustainable, because it's not. It's clearly not. But this is the life that we want for future generations. So this idea of what sustainable development is completely flawed. And I'll just end with this. Like, I'll just say, this is how I think about that question. Is it was when the idea of sustainable development first came out from the Brundtland Report. Probably many of you are too young to remember the Brundtland Report in 1987, and we were trying to figure out what this meant. So, and the Earth Summit happened in 1992. Canada signed on to this along with other nations around Agenda 21, sustainable development. And so it's been identified as a world problem for decades now. And we were sitting with, so I was working with the Chiefs of Ontario at the time, and we were trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean from an Indigenous perspective, which is like, how do we indigenize this concept? And there's an elder there, Elder Robin Green, and from Treaty 3 in Ontario, and he thinks in the language, he's a fluent language speaker. And so finally we have sense enough to kind of turn to him. I was a grad student at the time. And he just said, that's not how we think as Anishinaabe. But we don't think about how we're going to keep taking from the earth. Every morning we get up and we think about what's our gift going to be to the earth in order for it to flourish. That's the kind of thinking we need to have. We don't have that. Christmas is coming. Recently on the radio, garbage gets produced by 25 to 40%. We have to want different things. We have to want different things for our children and future generations. Do we want them to have a single dwelling home somewhere in Ontario? They're opening up the green belt and probably building hideous monstrosities all over the place. That's where we get our food. How can that possibly be a good idea? Because we want things. We have to not want things. And that's really, really hard. How do I not want my children to not have what I have, right? So how do we instill a different set of values that maybe what's more important is, making sure pollinators can survive? So that's a very different way of thinking about the earth. And that's probably what enabled survival for Anishinaabe, is getting up every day and thinking about, what is my gift going to be to the earth, not what I can keep taking sustainably. Completely different way of thinking about being in the world. We're not there. And that requires imagination. So if everyone tomorrow gets up and the first thing they think of is, what is my gift going to be so the earth can flourish, as opposed to what am I going to take? That might help, right? Because think about that. What does that look like? How do I start, if we're educators and teachers, how do we start educating and teaching people to be able to do this, including in our own families and children? And that's really, really hard. Because we're stuck, we think very linear in terms of the development model. So we think continuing this is the way to go, but maybe it's not. Maybe we start thinking more in terms of a cycle and in terms of a circle. And sometimes it means going back to square one. So it's very, that's how I'll answer them, because I don't think the techno fix is going to work. Because a techno fix it's damage control, it's mitigation, it's harm reduction. It's not underlying solution that needs to happen, and lacks a lot of imagination, in my view. It's not I'm saying smart people haven't thought of these things. They do, but they still think that they can control nature, and somehow people are smarter than nature. And I don't think that's true, actually. I think probably nature will do fine once we've imploded as humans. But ideally, we don't get there, again, because we have a responsibility and relationship to the natural world that's reciprocal. We're not living up to our end of that, unfortunately. So yeah, I wish there was a magic bullet to that, but that's hard. Think about that. Think about that tomorrow, everyone. Get up in the morning and think about, how am I going to allow it to flourish? And this is what you do every day, every moment, every decision. That's hard to do that. Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll end it with that. That was really great. I really liked how you touched on what can we bring to the earth from the Anishinaabeg point of view. And yeah, so I'm just going to thank you for being here, Deborah. It was amazing for you for joining us, and thank you for the amazing discussion. It was great to learn about Earth-based reconciliation, principles of planetary health, and self-determined solutions. And just before we end the webinar, we'd love to bring your attention to our upcoming UBC Learning Circle. Upcoming one is Practice Guidance to Improve Cancer Screening Care for First Nation Families. And that's on January 17th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And sign up for our newsletter. The link will be in the chat. All our webinars are free to sign up for on our website at www.learningcircle.ubc.ca. And thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next Learning Circle, and hope you have a great holidays. Lim Limt, thank you.
Bye everyone, thank you for joining us.